Evening, everybody. Good evening, everybody. First of all, thank you for inviting me to the Climate Cafe. Sarah, congratulations. That was a fascinating talk, and I agree with 95% of what you said. So thank you. My background is in oil and gas offshore engineering, and I spent a good 10 years in the subsea world in the North Sea before, rather strangely, going on to doing healthcare IT in hospitals in England. And my last 10 years, I've been retired and I'm teaching at a transport museum with heritage skills and STEM subjects. So if a few transport things crop up in my discussion tonight, you'll understand why. I chair a group called Decide Against Pylons. It was set up specifically to object to the way in which SSEN was connecting a substation in Kintore to another one down in Teeling. It's 107 kilometers of pylons, and we believe there's a better way. What I will stress is we're not NIMBYs, we're not climate deniers. I totally support the first 3/4 of Sarah's slideshow in what needs to be done. It just needs to be done in a better, safer, and cheaper way. Not that one, clearly. Let's try that one. I'm going to talk about why we don't like pylons, first of all, from a policy perspective, and then from a technical perspective. So starting with the policy, here's a picture of Wembley Stadium. Now, back in the times before it was a football pitch, it was a very large hayfield where hay was grown to supply the horses for the horse-drawn carriages in London. It was sold through Haymarket. So the supply of energy for transport in those days was local to the demand. That didn't seem. I'm trying to change slide here.
We'll try that.
Right, so that was the Victorian horse-drawn transport, and earlier we now get into the Industrial Revolution, where we had industry operating right beside where the coal mines were. The energy was produced local to the demand. So that was 200 or 300 years of learning. And where have we got to now? Not to the right. Oh, look, we're building wind farms in the Shetlands to power consumption in the south of England. And we've totally forgotten 300 years of solidly learnt engineering history here. I should point out that the first ever passenger carrying electric vehicle was built 500 meters from where we are today, 185 years ago. So we have some history here locally. That's irrelevant to pylons. This is a chart I stole from the Daily Telegraph. It shows the pylon density by community through the whole of the UK. And if you notice, in Scotland, in the SSEN area, that's because Scottish Power couldn't produce any data, but SSEN's area has the highest concentration of transmission pylons in the whole of Britain. And where's the demand? Oh, it's all around here. No pylons. That's a feature, we believe, of energy being produced in the wrong place. Sarah talked about contributing to employment. Since 2014, jobs in the energy world peaked in 2014 and have been declining ever since. We talked about high voltage AC pylons running right across the country. Less than 15% of that entire capital cost and lifetime cost is local. The steel coming from China, that one line alone has got 25,000 tons of CO2 just to produce the steel in China before it's shipped, made into girders, made into pylons. We currently have the highest electricity cost in the whole of the developed world, and that's largely because of this. Now, The key behind this is the UK, again, unique in the developed world, does not have any overall energy policy. Energy policy is reserved for the UK government, but the Scottish government has its own energy policies, no nuclear, no onshore, an onshore power. The British government until October had a separate policy with no onshore wind farms. The consent process for all this is all over the place. There's not a single strategy that links declining gas demand to nuclear, to other renewables that covers the entire country. So there's a complete mix. And at present, it's just a market free-for-all. Anybody with an investor can apply to put a wind farm anywhere they like in Scotland, and it will generally get consented. And SSEN, apart from the transmission world, is a major investor in these worlds. So it's been driven by investors with no real interest in what happens to our countryside. Right now, if you add up all the applications going into the energy consent unit in Holyrood, which is the consenting body for generation, for electricity generation, depends how you count it, but there's roughly 70 gigawatts of wind generation being proposed in Scotland. Right now, we are using 3. 70 gigawatts, 3 gigawatts locally. So none of this, whatever you might say within the SSEN world, is for Scotland's benefit. It's whistling straight down south. It's being exported for zero benefit to the communities. The UK grid upgrade, the last figure I saw was about 120 billion. So the current SSEN plan is about 20 billion. So we're looking at 120 billion of upgrades, which translates to about £2,000 per person, man, woman, and child across the whole UK. Now, if somebody can explain to me how Miliband can stand up and tell me that's going to reduce our electricity prices, I'd love to see the mathematics behind it. It does not stack up. The maths just aren't there. So on the technology side, in the UK, almost uniquely in the world, the default solution is high voltage AC transmission overland by pylons. We're almost the only country left doing that. Onshore transmission, if you look right across the world, US, Canada, Brazil, China, India, and thousands of other countries I could mention, are going with high voltage DC and largely buried. Sarah talked about a excavation in the ground, the width of a football pitch. That's talking about high voltage AC being buried, where you need a separate line for each of the 18 different conductors. That's a 2 gigawatt line in a trench 2 meter wide. And that's before you start looking at things like improved processes for burying cables, like molding, where you just drag it behind a tractor and bury it without any intrusion on the surface. So that's the assumption in this country, and we're one of the few countries still insisting upon high voltage AC with pylons. These things are big. These things are big and they're ugly. To put it into context, at the bottom, that's a fairly standard Scottish house. These are on the right-hand side is a typical existing transmission pylon. The ones being proposed now to run 400 kilovolts with 6 gigawatts of power are anywhere from 56 to 70 meters tall. Do any of you know Crathes Castle? This is 2.5 times higher than Crathes Castle. I was going to bring a model on tonight, but the weather was too heavy to carry it and bring it with me, but there we go. There is a major negative impact on farming. If you run a high voltage AC line across prime agricultural land in the Mearns, which is the main seed potato supply in the UK, if you take your muddy boots, which SSEN unfortunately have the habit of doing, you destroy that land. The biosecurity required to keep out PCNs, potatoes, cyst nematodes, and clubroot, which can destroy that entire industry completely, is one of the few clean bits of soil for potato growth I'm sure you'd support me on that. You require every vehicle, every boot, every tyre to be steam cleaned to remove that risk of carrying those nematodes onto the land, then take that water and dispose of it safely. SSEN has been in breach of that during the Bewley-Denny line you mentioned, and currently the protocols being suggested by them and by their contractors are dreadful. They are totally and woefully inadequate. We're at risk of destroying a major farming industry up here. Tourism and business, a survey was done in East Anglia, where some of this power that Sherry was talking about is going to come onshore and run right across Norfolk, down through Essex, down towards London. They've done a survey with a whole array of businesses, tourism, right across that entire area of southeast England. Guess how many of those said this is really good for our business? Not one. It's going to have a negative impact on all the industries and all the businesses in that part of the world, and it'll be the same up here. Now, in England, pylons are banned in areas of outstanding natural beauty and in the national parks. But for some quirk of history in Scotland, there are no areas of designated beauty. I think it's because 99% of Scotland is an area of outstanding natural beauty. If we apply the same policies to, say, to Aberdeenshire as you apply to Yorkshire, the whole of Aberdeenshire, the whole of Angus would be protected. Now, in those areas, pylons are banned. They're not allowed to cross areas of outstanding beauty. In Scotland, there's no such policy. And if you talk to the Scottish government, which I have been down there and talked to Holyrood, they can go anywhere. This doesn't actually count. Now, they've tried to resist it across the Cairngorm National Park. Oh, except Bewley-Denny line went right through it. So that's my big worry from that perspective. If I carry on to the next bit, the health side. We have done a lot of research into this, and all of the current guidelines were set in about 1990 by the International Committee for Non-Iodizing Radiation Protection. Their guidelines were updated a little while later, and that is a pan-national body, an international body, and everybody you talk to says, oh, we're just following the guidelines. We have presented SSEN, the Scottish Health Authorities, the British Health Authorities, the Scottish Government, the UK Government, and the how you pronounce it, ICNIRP, with evidence produced within the last 10 years that show, contrary to a lot of stuff you might have heard on the press or on SSEN's literature, the high voltage AC, which has very high voltage alternating current, induces magnetic fields which are harmful to people. Bear in mind, the pylons being planned right now are carrying something like 6 gigawatts. The normal ones you see around here at present are carrying 1 or 2. The magnetic field is proportional to the current, proportional to the power of the same voltage. So this is 3-4 times bigger than we've ever seen before, and we are the guinea pigs for that. We have got thousands of hours of research put into this. SSEN totally refuses to acknowledge that's happening, saying we're following the guidelines. There's one of the most interesting pieces of research, which was a meta-study that looked at all the papers that have been published, and they compared the outcome with who funded it. And guess what? Every paper which was funded by the industry or by the government said, oh, there's no problem at all. Every study which was independent from that funding, done by academics and doctors and research elsewhere, said there was a problem. So that's anybody in academia will realize that's how funding works. You've got to say what your funder expects you to say. One of the arguments is no one's ever demonstrated the actual mechanism for how an alternating current can affect your body. In the last decade, that's been demonstrated. I'm not a doctor. I'll only confuse myself if I talk about it, but it's the communication electronically between the cells in your body. There's now a proven impact on how that happens. At the very least, given that evidence, we should apply the precautionary principle and not allow things of this size to be brought across our countryside. every time we talk to anybody, and I can understand why SSEN say we're just following the government guidelines, they in turn saying following the international guidelines. Someone on the line has got to stand up and say, this is wrong, and change how that's being done. Bizarrely, the advice from the ICNIRP is for a threshold of about 100 microteslas. In this country, it's 360 microteslas. So our threshold is 4 times worse than any other civilized country. What I haven't mentioned on there is the mental health impact. Sarah talked about the consulting they're doing. If she's been to those meetings, she'll know people are coming out in tears when they see what's happening to their communities. Now, I come from an offshore background. I come from a subsea background. In the 1990s, I worked with Scottish Hydro to take high voltage DC from Peterhead out to some of the offshore oil platforms. So I don't know a lot about these things, but I know a bit about it. And we believe that a subsea, properly organized grid done holistically, not just by transmission owner, and transmission owner, is the right solution. You'll see in every press thing you read and elsewhere that subsea is 8 times more expensive than overhead lines. If you read the report where that was done, it was the Parsons-Brinkhoff study in 2012. That was based on data earlier than that. So we're talking about something now which is 12 to 15 years out of date. There's a very heavy proviso in there. Do not use this ratio without looking at all detail behind it. And for start, it was comparing a 75-kilometer line of pylons with a 75-kilometer line of subsea DC. Nobody would ever put in 75 kilometers of DC unless you had to transmit from an island to an island somewhere else. We're talking about power going 800, 1,000 kilometers from here. So at that stage, because the capital cost of the DC is tied up in the converter stations that you mentioned earlier, Ashley, that capital cost doesn't change whether it's 1 meter apart or 1,000 meters apart. So as you get further and further away, the unit cost gets lower and lower and lower. Whereas if you double the length of pylons, lo and behold, they're twice the price if it's twice the distance. Plus, you have to add more substations to correct all the things that go wrong with AC over long distance. The study was based on technology it was 15 years ago. It has changed dramatically now. So the converter stations you wouldn't recognize today if you were living in 2012. They're modularized, they're compact, they're basically standardized. Also, the equation that's done when we say that pylons are cheaper, it totally ignores the socio-economic costs. Now, going to the consultation meetings with SSEN, I've been told consistently, including by land managers, that a 65-meter pylon right beside my house has no impact on the value of the property. There are countless papers arguing against that. To put it into context, we're looking at 100 kilometers of pylons. That's going to hit property values by about 200 million pounds. 200 million pounds by property values. The farming, I talked about the risk of biosecurity a minute ago. If you run high voltage pylons across your land and you're growing seed potatoes, you need one of these water jets that spray water to irrigate your crops. Imagine what happens if you do that beside a 400 kilovolt bare aluminum alloy conductor, you die. If you get too close to a tractor in bad weather, there's a risk of arcing. So you're wiping out whole sections of farming which you just cannot use anymore because of the pylons of this voltage, this power running across that land. DC is a far more efficient way in terms of losses than AC over long distance. So not only have you got all the socioeconomic costs ignored, your power losses are less. It's probably got 1% over 1,000 kilometers of DC, and with a string of substations at AC, it's probably 4 or 5 times that. Every consultation document, all the RAG rating that SSEN has done extremely well, I have to say, I mean, it's very well presented. All of them say there's a negative visual impact. It's unavoidable. That doesn't come into the equation at all. You don't often see subsea lines standing on the beach. there's no visual impact. It's been, what, 2.5 years since this line was first planned? We're still talking about it. We haven't even finished the consultation process yet, 2.5 years into the process, because you only object to something if it's objectionable when it's put to you in the first place. So if you propose objectionable technology, people are going to object. Here, New Delhi, East Anglia, all over the country, people are saying exactly the same thing. I just mentioned before that going subsea is a lot cheaper. We're also facing an area now, which is probably the first time in my lifetime, threats of violence from criminals and from other governments to our electricity infrastructure. Now, I'm not advocating this, but knocking a pylon down with a bit of explosive cord would take Dave and I about 10 seconds in the cover of darkness. Trying to cut a subsea cable in 100 fathoms that's operating at 525 kilovolts is a whole new story. So that energy security is not just about making sure enough energy for our country to use, it's about protecting that against criminals and people living in countries who don't like our way of life. So my conclusion is that the pylons we're looking at, high voltage AC pylons, is the wrong technology for long distance transmission in the UK. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you.